thought Chris was going to be back here, but yeah, he said he was going to round people up, but so I don't know. He doesn't seem to be right. Yeah, well, that's the other thing. I guess I could introduce myself. Hi there. Hi everyone. Wouldn't be the first time. I assume. We're all going to leave. All right. He only rounded up one. He only rounded up one.
Yeah, that was very.
Just relax for a couple seconds because there's a few people that aren't here yet that I really want to be here. Like
Okay.
my boss.
Hippel's heckling me.
I'm going to provide a little bit of a space here just because I know there's a few people that haven't yet made it this morning, and this group has done such an outstanding job in preparation that I really don't want those who are going to be here in a few minutes to miss any of this. So I'd like to take the opportunity to do a little housekeeping and provide a little response to some of the questions and concerns that I've been hearing, and in order to make this process a little more effective, if that's possible. Anyway, first I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful job that the presenters did yesterday. Let's all give them a big hand. There are a few of you, and I say few, and that's probably more than really what's been going on. There's just been a couple who have actually fed information in the form of ideas or questions back to the coordinating group. And the ones that have been passed back have been really interesting and are going to help us understand what you're thinking and what we can do as we're moving forward here. So I'd encourage you to, at any moment in time, if you feel as though it's important for all of us to respond to one of these questions that we've been flashing up on the board, write it down and bring it back there. It's amazing how fast we can get that up and get the tabulated responses back to you in a matter of minutes. The things that you saw yesterday were developed like that, and so I'd really encourage you, because some of you are coming up this morning and saying, wow, I'd like to ask this or that, or, well, we have the process in place to be able to do it, so please take advantage of that at any time. The second issue that's come to my attention is the need for follow-up to some of those questions. People are curious as to why there was some diversity of opinion regarding some of the questions. And perhaps one way to deal with that is to give us some time to follow up. If we do have a question and there are some responses and we move forward, please bring it to our attention that, wow, we need to discuss that a little bit, and we'll definitely take the time because it's very important. So why don't we just begin with a little exercise here before we introduce the mental health group in response to one of the questions yesterday, which several people have asked me to follow up with. And that had to do with the disclosure issue regarding sound levels in ensembles within schools, both at the college and at the high school level. There was 15 or 20% that said, no, we shouldn't disclose. And it's very curious as to why that response was there. It is for me, and it is for others, apparently. So if you are of the opinion that that's something that we don't want to do, we'd like to discuss it, because it's very, very important to understand your perspective on that issue. So please come on up and share your opinion with us.
Well, since I was one of the persons who thought that we really should follow up on some of the items, I wasn't particularly asking on that, but one of the feedbacks I got from several people is that the way the questions were worded, they felt ambiguous about how to answer. And I think that may have been the case why, for example, in the question that you just brought up, I wasn't certain, because we had learned yesterday that it's a matter of duration. And since with music, and particularly well-performed music, the loud and soft changes repeatedly, I really don't know at this point how much exposure to high decibel is becomes dangerous in music performance. So just to say we have to let the parents know that, let's say we do a cymbal clash and therefore for 2 seconds there is a 115 decibel level, that wouldn't be enough to inform parents. So this gets a little bit more complicated when it comes to music and performance in the band hall. So that is my answer to the question, but it might be possible for us to know how we can refine the questions and then have a follow-up, and I talked to George about that, and so that becomes a matter of knowing how to write questions again. So that is part of the problem that I heard yesterday.
Anyone else? That's a very good point. If we were to assume that the protocol for characterizing these sound pressure levels was in compliance with or mandated or directed with an accepted approach to characterizing these sound levels, which exists. So if we went into a school ensemble and took the types of measures that are acceptable to those who take these kinds of measures, and come to find out that the sound levels are of a certain, or meet a certain threshold that would be deemed risky based on those procedures, then regardless of the acceptance of the procedures, just given the fact that these are the accepted procedures used in industry, and they did exceed the limits that would be allowable in industry, would we then feel as though it's necessary, or would we want to inform the students and or the parents if they're minors? And if you look at the literature that's coming out in the performing arts medicine as it relates to the quantification of these characteristics, you'll see that the methodologies used do adhere to those accepted protocols in industry and industrial hygiene. We can talk about that later, but I think that's an established procedure that we can use now, and we have been publishing data. There's a very interesting discussion that I heard yesterday, for instance, of a drum and bugle corps having been measured during a camp, I suppose, a festival of some kind, where the students were performing and practicing all day. In one of the dosimeters, outcomes at the end of the day showed that one of the individuals had an exposure rate, which we would call dose, 100% dose being the allowable limit for that particular day. Well, this person had a dose for that day that was 6,000%. 6,000%. And I believe this was a minor. So if we have data that says that this child is exposed to 6,000% of the allowable dose using the accepted standards. Yes, Alice is making funny faces at me. That's what I was saying yesterday too, 6,000%. I mean, we've been characterizing sound pressure levels in our ensembles for quite a while, but we've never reached anything like that. But that discussion has been circulating here, and it's a recent event, and it seems to be credible, but it's just amazing. But anyway, the question remains, you know, if we do use these approaches that are acceptable by other industries or other areas, and they've been established as good approaches, methodologies to characterize these issues, and we do use them, and we do find out that we're exceeding what other people would say are risky, do we feel as though it's responsible to tell the students and or the parents if it's a minor? So I'd like to continue to think about that question. And please, if you have any additional questions, concerns, things that you'd like to have little discussions about, responses to some of these questions, new questions to pose, different ways to ask the same question, write it down and pass it back to Kathy and George back there. It would be great help to this process. Little housekeeping. This afternoon's lunch is going to be similar to what lunch was like yesterday. The two working groups, music education and the liaison groups, will be meeting after they get their box lunches again across the hall. And some of the subgroups and things I know have been meeting, and just find yourself another corner and have at it. And then at the end of the day, at 5 o'clock, we really do need to be out of this room at 5, because they're going to turn the room so we can have our dinner and concert in here tonight, starting at 7 o'clock, so we need to get the room vacated. And also, there's going to be a photographer here ready and waiting for the groups to stand posed, and whoever else wants to get their picture taken out here in the lobby, he'll be floating around. So I'd recommend that the group leaders maybe hustle up and try to strategize and think about getting your groups ready for this opportunity to capture this event. Well, anyway, with great appreciation and excitement and enthusiasm, I'd like to introduce Dr. Susan Rayburn, who I've known now for several years, and been very fortunate to have gotten to know her. And when I asked her to be part of this, and she said yes, it was just a dream come true. And as you'll see this morning, this is one tenacious group. They've been getting at it for, a year and a half? A year and a half, thinking and digesting the information that's available. And as you look inside of your notebooks, you'll see these papers that have been well thought through, and we're going to have a delightful morning. Susan Rayburn.
Thanks, Chris. I was kind of kidding Chris yesterday in the hallway about, well, if nothing else, about putting this conference on when his daughters become old enough to get married, that he will have had it all worked out, you know, how to organize a big event like this. So anyway, but good morning. Good morning, and thank you for joining us at this early hour. I was thinking that we could pretend this was a simulation of the musician lifestyle. If any of you were up late last night and then having to be here at 8 a.m., kind of like, you know, doing a gig and then having to go to your day job in the morning. I'm also kind of simulating doing the gig here without a rehearsal, since many of us are new to PowerPoint. So, but you all seem like a pretty friendly audience from yesterday. I'm also, you know, I like to bring a flock of mental health professionals with me at all times, so I figured no matter what else, you know, I'm covered. I am disappointed to say, though, seriously, that Julie Jaffe-Nagel is home sick in Michigan with the flu, so Eric Maisel is going to be doing her PowerPoint today on performance anxiety. So, okay. The National Association of Schools of Music, with the help of Dr. Chris Chesky and the University of North Texas Music and Medicine program, have given us an opportunity here to shepherd future generations of college music students into their adult life in a new and thoughtful way. How many of us would have benefited from systematic guidance about our health and career as young people? Would we have listened, taken in the guidance available, and put it into action in our lives? This is what UNT's ambitious health promotion project will help determine for future music students. But no matter how relevant, information alone is not going to be sufficient. It will be within the context of ongoing relationships over time between the students and the important people in their lives and the important environments and institutions that the success of this project will ultimately be measured. On behalf of the Mental Health Work Group, I would like to thank Dr. Chesky and UNT for including us in this exciting endeavor. My job this morning is to frame the presentations and the recommendations that follow to students by providing you with some basic definitions and guiding assumptions used in the work of the Mental Health Group. And given our full schedule, I'm going to just introduce everybody as they do their individual presentation. And I also would encourage you to read the written materials that we've provided, because, you know, trying to talk about any of these issues, we're all up against it here at the conference, in such an abbreviated way doesn't really do justice to the topics. Dr. Chesky instructed our groups to develop what we thought students needed to know, believe, and do about mental health-related issues, and to identify key stakeholders that influence their world in the process. Given the complexity and vast scope of possible issues impacting a person's mental health, this has been a little bit like reducing the universe into a star. Nonetheless, we hope that our star will illuminate part of the sky here for the students, and then we'll throw in some maps and compasses. Okay, so we're going to start with some definitions. To begin with, the Surgeon General defines mental health as a state of successful performance of mental function resulting in productive activities, fulfilling relationships with other people, and the ability to adapt to change and to cope with adversity. Sounds good, huh? As opposed to mental health problems that are defined as signs and symptoms of insufficient intensity or duration to meet the criteria for any mental disorder, but the distress felt matches some of the signs and symptoms of a disorder. And then we get to mental illness, which is the term that refers collectively to anything in the Diagnostic Standard Manual of diagnosable mental disorders, or again, health conditions that are characterized by alterations in thinking, mood, or behavior, usually some combination, associated with distress and or impaired functioning, as well as significantly increased risk of suffering, death, pain, disability, or an important loss of freedom. Okay. The optimal promotion of mental health also requires the active encouragement of psychological wellness, competence, resilience, and overall emotional intelligence. Okay. These functions are largely developed in infancy and childhood by the quality of early parental and environmental responsiveness and the person's individual adaptation to those environments and relationships. So new learning continues to be beneficial at any point along the way. I failed to write down where my PowerPoints were on this, so you bear with me. Okay. Okay. So the point here is that the Health Promotion of Schools of Music project has to actively address the needs of college students across that whole spectrum, from promoting wellness in students who are already pretty healthy and doing well, to supporting students facing kind of common and pretty temporary forms of distress, to assisting those living with more acute or chronic diagnosable mental disorders. Okay, here are some assumptions that our group made. First one is that that the mind and body operate as a transactional whole, although we may distinguish between mental health and physical health for the sake of argument, discussion, analysis, and intervention. I think I skipped one here. No? Okay. That mental health status is a product of dynamic, multiple transactions between a person's biology, psychology, and their ecology, you might say, of social, cultural, and physical environments in the past and in the present. We believe that health promotion must utilize the social, cultural, and environmental forces in that student's specific ecology, and this includes valuing emotional intelligence up there with IQ. We also believe that the developmental tasks of young adulthood, such as separation, individuation from parents, consolidation of identity, and exploring relationships and intimacy, have to be incorporated into the materials as well as in their dissemination. Okay. Let me make sure I haven't left anything out here that I wanted to say. Okay. So as you can tell, we're approaching this from a systems perspective. Okay, so here's what we want students to know, believe, and do. First of all, we want students to understand. I'm realizing that I think the slides actually went in a different order than I have, so excuse me, I'll just try to catch up with myself. Okay, we want students to understand what kind of expectable challenges or mental health problems they may experience, and how to take care of themselves in response, and persevere in the face of normal setbacks. This is really an important point, to know that that's part of life and not just something that they're messing up and have to, overwhelm them. Again, I'm out of order here. We want students to identify early warning signs and symptoms of mental health disorders, and obviously problems come in there. Know whether they're at risk to develop these problems, and learn how and when to get help. We want students to develop realistic expectations about their career issues, learn how to establish professional self-care and support, understand how mind, body, and emotions interact within the performance context, and have access to established coping strategies. I think there was, I don't know if we'll see it here, but no. There was a slide where I said, basically we also wanted students to have, this got left out I think, direct ways of identifying, valuing, and relating to their emotions and needs. We want them to get to know their internal worlds and to value those. We also want them to have direct ways of relating, communicating, and valuing connection to others, which again includes being able to ask for help when they need it. Okay. All right, so here are the mental health content areas that we chose as a group to pursue. Some things are left out of here, for example, eating disorders, and obviously if this was a conference for dancers, that would be kind of right up there. If any of you, because of course for college-age students in general, eating disorders are a big problem, and if any of you feel like you would like references about that, that happens to be one of my specialty areas, be happy to talk to me after. I'd be happy to give you some references for that. In the same sense, we did not get into learning disabilities like ADHD, which often do, you know, those are problems kids have coming into college counseling centers, but we didn't really pursue talking about that. So there's certainly things left out here, but hopefully what we are talking about are pretty central. First area is self-care and self-management. Again, this idea of emotional intelligence, that students learn how to take care of themselves emotionally and how to self-regulate their feelings and needs. We also think relationships are very important, obviously in many ways, both with peers, family, as well as institutions and teachers. And then we wanted to talk about, again, mental health problems and disorders at points along that continuum. So we've chosen to talk about anxiety and stress, pretty major for everybody, more specifically performance anxiety, depression, and then substance use and abuse. And then last but not least, we'll talk about career issues for music students. Okay. So the prevalence of mental health problems in musicians is, again, if you look at your materials, I've taken quite a bit of time trying to pull together the data that we have on this, but the choice of the areas that we've used really did come out of, aside from the clinical expertise of our group, came out of looking at the information that is available on college counseling center utilization, college music student surveys, and surveys of classical and non-classical professional musicians. As some of you may know, is that on there somewhere? Nope. Okay, well, some of my slides get lost, but the gold standard of health surveys on musicians, as many of you already know, remains the survey conducted for the International Conference of Symphony and Orchestra Musicians, ICSOM. Unlike the majority of other musician surveys, this survey of professional musicians had a large sample size, over 2,000 musicians, and an excellent response rate. Basically, about 55% of the musicians surveyed in 48 orchestras took part in that. And so we'd have to say that that is the most credible window to date on professional musician self-report of health problems. Just in brief, since I think we have time, the ICSOM findings showed that 13% of the musicians reported a problem with anxiety, with 8% indicating it was a severe problem. 25% reported a problem with stage fright, with 16% calling it a severe problem. 17% reported a depression problem, with 7% indicating severe. 10% indicated an alcohol problem, and about 20% were concerned with drugs, prescription and non-prescription. And unlike some of my surveys and John's surveys of rock and rollers or popular musicians, I think a lot of the classical musicians, my understanding was, were talking more about use of drugs like Inderal. So it wasn't just all OxyContin and Vicodin with those folks, I think. Although Alice, Dr. Bronfenberger might know more about that too. Okay, so all of that put together helped us choose these areas. And when viewed cumulatively, even though a lot of the other musician surveys have not been as rigorously done because they tend to be convenient samples rather than randomized studies or like that, which is pretty much the state of the art, I think, where we are of needing to do more systematic work. But those findings, if you look at all of them, they kind of mirror the ICSOM findings around self-report of musician problems. Okay, so that's all for me right now. Thank you for your attention. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you the other members of the mental health work group, beginning with Dr. Louise Montello, who's going to speak to you about self-care and self-management. And just let me introduce Louise briefly. Louise is a music therapist, psychoanalyst, the director of Musicians Wellness, Inc. in New York City, and is also the conference representative for the American Music Therapy Association. Okay, Dr. Montello. You need that. You want this? Yeah, or you can talk to me.
Let's see. Self-care. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. It's an amazing dream to see this kind of a conference happening. For so many years, I've done research on stress and performing arts. I hope you can hear me. Let's see. And every time I do another study and I work with another group of stressed and anxious musicians, my heart breaks a little bit. And now we're here together and we're solving this problem, and I just think it's remarkable. So I'm going to be talking about self-care, and I want to start by reading a paragraph out of an article that one of my students just wrote. She did a survey on performance anxiety in her university in Southampton, England. And this is just one of the many students that I've worked with who have done research on stress within their own institutions. And so she says, a full 90% of the Southampton University music students consider themselves to suffer from performance anxiety. I was astounded to discover this figure when researching for my final year dissertation. And when I interviewed these students, the majority revealed no discussion of this performance problem in their music lessons and very little knowledge or understanding of the matter. Although every student could identify with the unbearable symptoms of stage fright, few could say any more. So it's just amazing. This is one situation. I've done another study at Berklee School of Music, a similar experience there with students who have tremendous performance anxiety and performance-related disorders. Another study was done actually at LaGuardia High School in New York City with the kind of the FAME students, and it looks like they're having such a great time and wearing funny clothes and having fun, but they're suffering too. So there's such a need for us to be doing this work and understanding how we can help them to prevent this kind of intense anxiety, which, as you probably all know, is related to overuse injuries. When you're anxious, when you're perfectionistic, you are tense most of the time. And if you're trying to play with tension, you are going to hurt yourself over a long period of time or even a short period of time. So it's really, really important to learn how to manage this kind of anxiety. Okay, so these are the epidemic proportions of performance anxiety. I've done research at NYU for the past 15 years on stress and performing arts, and these are the major factors that I found that are underlying anxiety, stress, and other disorders. The first is lack of body-mind awareness. Most music students don't really understand the connection between the mind and the body. And often many of them have learned to cut off their feelings and other bodily sensations that are related to stress and just push through it in order to, what many of my students say, is get through a performance. And this is very dangerous just in terms of killing the sense of joy in being a musician and also in leading to injuries and other kinds of disorders. So it's very important for them from the beginning of their educational process to have training in learning how to understand how the body and the mind work together. And I'll go into this a little bit in a minute. The second factor that I found was polarized perfectionism. And when I say polarized, I mean a student feels that if I'm not the best, if I'm not perfect, I am a failure. Okay, and that's a very extreme state of tension to feel that you have to be perfect all the time. And from what I understand in working with a lot of conservatories and music schools, this sense of perfectionism is really part of the educational tradition, which is something that I think we need to address here, and not to really support this sense of do or die in music training. The next category that we found was the idea of, that Susan mentioned, that most of the kids we're dealing with are still adolescents. And they're dealing with issues like leaving home and separation, individuation, and finding themselves. So when you put students into an environment where there's no space to find themselves, no space to get to know themselves, but just one task after another, that really takes away from the normal developmental experience that students need to have in becoming a person. So many of the students and musicians that I work with, when you ask them about who they are, they don't know. Well, I'm a musician. And I think that really can lead to mental kinds of problems like depression and anxiety and substance abuse. When you don't know who you are, if there's a sense of emptiness underneath your task-oriented life, eventually that's going to catch up to you, particularly if you're not on top. And I see this a lot with prodigies. They're, from an early age, they're performing, they're in the spotlight, they're what some of my students call themselves as dancing clowns. And suddenly, or finally, they're adults and they're not on top anymore. And they have to work with other people, maybe as sidemen, or they'll have to be second fiddle. And it can really cause tremendous breakdowns in some of the, particularly the prodigies that I've worked with, because they don't know who they are. And so I think this conference is really great because we're dealing with college-age musicians, but I think the problem really goes way back to the early years of musical training. So we'll have to have another conference to address early music education at some point. And finally, there's overwhelming demands in most music schools and conservatories that I've worked with in terms of the workloads of the students. And this can be tremendously stressful. One of the things that prevents stress and anxiety in all people is having a balance between rest and activity. And in so many of the students that I work with, they don't have time to rest. And that, again, in terms of leading to overuse injuries, if you don't rest your body, you can injure it. And part of having healthy mental life is having time to goof off, to daydream, to have fun with music. That's another thing that I often don't see in conservatory students. They don't get together and just jam. Everything has to be serious. So very important for educators to be aware of all these things. I want to go now into the idea of wellness as an important factor in preventing these kinds of problems in college-age music students. And I just want to read to you my definition of wellness, which I think is so important for all of us. Wellness is defined as an active, lifelong process of fostering health and wholeness through becoming aware of the interrelatedness of body, mind, spirit, and community. It involves the willingness to take responsibility for one's own health and healing, and to be proactive in creating a balanced and fulfilling life. okay, a lot of musicians who are older are living in a kind of dependency situation where they get injured, they have anxiety, they're dependent upon others to fix them so that they can go back out there and play. And that kind of mentality is survival-based. It's not really helping the musician to grasp the therapeutic value of their music for both themselves and for the audience. A lot of them are just getting by. And the wellness model is the opposite. It's that we wake up in the morning and we decide, today I'm going to take care of myself. Today I'm going to breathe properly. Today I'm going to take time for relaxation. Today I'm going to improvise. I'm going to create music. I'm going to have a wonderful experience with finding more about the internal workings of a particular musical piece, as opposed to just learning it and then spewing it out. So, and this is something that I really think students need to have as they come in to their BA degrees in music, a mandatory course on performance wellness that starts with the idea of breath awareness. Every stress that we have in life cuts down our breathing. Okay, we hold our breath. And breath holding prevents oxygen from flowing through the body, which allows our muscles and our whole bodies to be healthy. And also calms down the nervous system. When we're in a fight or flight mode, when we're anxious, the nervous system is hyper-aroused. And we're in a state of not being able to do our best. I'm sure all of you know that experience of having to perform and your heart is pounding, your mouth is dry, and your hands are shaking, and you really can't communicate. And so simply by focusing on the breath, learning how to calm down your breath, learning how to breathe rhythmically can help you to turn around the stress response into a relaxation response. And kids need to know this. In fact, the kids I work with at LaGuardia High School, I see them on the street sometimes in Manhattan, and they're like, Dr. Montello, you know, we learned a lot from you, but the breathing exercises are the thing that I do every day now, and it's changed my life. Relaxation techniques, to actually take the time every day to relax for 20 minutes. And there are some very good exercises that are clinically tested that really work in counteracting chronic tension and stress. Cognitive restructuring, restructuring negative thoughts. The inner critic is really at the root of most performance anxiety. And guess who the inner critic really is? The inner critic is a lot of the negative feedback that we got early in life from teachers, parents, friends, peers. And that kind of gets hardwired in our personalities and just comes up to haunt us every time that we perform. So cognitive restructuring helps us to look at those self-defeating thoughts and transform them into life-enhancing thoughts. Mindfulness meditation. Susan mentioned the idea that students need to learn how to look within to get a sense of what they're made of. And meditation is really a process of learning how to observe yourself, how to observe your thoughts, your feelings, things like that, and to maintain a level of detachment from it. I am not my thoughts. I am not my feelings. I am not my body. And it's a wonderful stress-reducing technique, and you'll see it, it's written about in newspapers and magazines everywhere these days. It's very exciting. Imagery training. How do athletes do so well? How do they really strive to compete and to win? A lot of them use imagery, and that's something that musicians take very well to as well. Visualizing a really great performance, visualizing themselves being calm, being centered, radiating healing energy through their music. Music therapy, that's my love. I've been a music therapist for 20 years. And the reason why I got into this work of wanting to help musicians is that I realized that so many musicians are suffering. Music therapy is about healing through music. And so the idea of music students learning about this concept, that you can use music every day in your life to uplift your spirit, to commune with your deeper self, to share that sense of depth and beauty with your audience. So many of the students that I work with don't really think about the audience. I mean, I've heard students say, oh, yeah, I just imagine there are a bunch of pumpkins out there. It's like, well, why are you doing this? To me, the essence of performance is really communicating beauty and helping people to uplift their spirit. And so music therapy, I think, can kind of awaken that sense in music students. And a lot of them got into music for that very reason, because it's beauty, because it's truth, because it's joy. And we don't want that to be cut out of a student's life. And from the perspective of global healing, the planet really needs a lot of love and beauty right now. And my thought is that if all musicians are playing with this kind of intelligence, of knowing that through their music they can help to uplift the spirit of this planet, can you imagine? Things could really change. I mean, there have been studies done on meditation, groups of people meditating in a high crime area, and after 6 months of that meditation, the crime rate went significantly down. So if musicians are playing music with this sense of spirit of uplifting humanity all over the world, it's an awesome thought, and I hope that you'll think about it too. I don't know how much time I have. I might be taking too much time. Disarming the inner critic. There are lots of creative techniques that we do in music therapy, fun techniques to unravel some of the dark areas of the psyche. And all of us have it. You know, traumas from childhood, experiences where we were humiliated by our teachers. These are things that are hard to reach. But in my research, I found that most people with intense anxiety have some unresolved trauma in their lives, and we all have it. And by continuing to push it down, push it away, drink or use substances to try to get rid of it, it's just making it worse. We're never going to grow. So things like creative improvisation, using imagery, using role-playing, these kinds of things can help to externalize these kinds of traumas so that we can work them through. And even just having an environment where musicians can talk about things. I don't think this would necessarily be appropriate in an educational institution, but certainly the counseling centers could institute this kind of thing where they have these creative groups where students can work on these deeper issues. Assertiveness training. I don't know about you, but many musicians that I know are very compliant. They want to fit in. That's been their role from very early in life, is being a part of a group and not standing up for themselves. So music students really need to know how to communicate with their teachers, with their band leader, with their co-musicians. And to be able to ask for what they need and to be able to say no to things that don't seem appropriate. I've been talking to some of the people here in the audience, and they've been talking about how rehearsals are overly long. There are too many of them. They have to play a piece without proper rehearsal time. Now, these are things that can really kill the spirit of musicians over time. And I think you all have the right to address this with the conductor, with management, whatever. It's very important to know that you're empowered to do that. Finally, emotional intelligence. This is something that, again, Susan mentioned, that students need to learn what are their emotions. And not only what are their emotions, but how to modulate feelings. Feelings can change, and feelings do change. And often students think, if I'm feeling something, I'm just going to be overwhelmed. So that's what emotional intelligence is. It's the process of exploring the range of emotions and knowing that you can have some measure of control over them. And also the idea that music is very much related to emotions. A lot of kids don't make that connection, that I'm really expressing some human stuff here in my music, and that's very meaningful. So that's generally what I wanted to say in terms of the idea of using these techniques on a daily basis to create a sense of balance in your life, to have time for fun, to have time for play, and finally, the idea of having some kind of a mandatory course in performance wellness that addresses both the stuff we talked about yesterday, the hearing problems, the vocal problems, these mental health problems, and I'm sure we'll find out more about the musculoskeletal problems later today. But thank you for your attention. If you'd like to talk to me more about this later, I have a whole program on performance wellness that I've instituted at several universities in New York and Boston and New Jersey. So thank you very much.
I just want to say after Louisa's discussion about, healing the planet and all that we ought to have like a group hug at this point. Hey, I love that. It makes me feel guilty that I'm not doing my meditation practice every day, but I have a feeling now that this conference is over, I might be able to get back to it, actually. Okay, so next we're going to be hearing from Dr. Eric Maisel, my good friend from San Francisco. And Eric is quite an interesting man who I've had the pleasure of getting to know. He is primarily an author, and many of you may be familiar with some of his books on working with artists, musicians, writers, and I know I found some of Eric's books personally very helpful about managing anxiety, like Fearless Creating, and kind of the whole process of creating whatever your particular form of it is. Anyway, Eric is an MFT and PhD, author, psychotherapist, and creativity coach from San Francisco, California.
What a nice group of pumpkins out there. Okay, am I organized? Am I hearable? Okay. Good morning. Relationships are probably the least explored area of mental health. You'll find virtually nothing about relationships in the diagnostic manuals for therapists. Most family therapists fly by the seat of their pants and use common sense and everyday wisdom in terms of how to work with couples and how to work with relationships. I want to start with an anecdote which I think analogizes to our territory. I was seeing a young musician couple. The fellow was a composing student and the woman was an instrumentalist, oboist actually. And the presenting problem was that each felt the other didn't respect the other. Didn't respect the other in terms of time spent and energy spent and the way they were living their lives. The composer believed that the woman didn't think he was really working when he was just staring into space, but of course he was really working. And she didn't believe that he respected just how much time it took to make the reeds and all of those things. Normal, everyday relationship issues. But the presenting problem, and sometimes the presenting problems in therapy, counseling, or coaching are the smallest possible presenting problems. This had to do with a pane of glass. They had like one nice piece of furniture in their apartment which was a break front of some sort, and a pane of glass had broken. And each wanted the other to find the time to get that piece of glass repaired. And each presumed that it would take, 7 minutes to get it done, And why couldn't the other person find those 7 minutes since the other person was busier? So I pulled out my little erasable board that I have in my office, one of those little whiteboards, to work on how much time it actually takes to change a pane of glass, a broken pane of glass. Well, somebody had to like get on the phone and find out whether a glazier or whatever the person would be called, and take measurements and go in rush hour traffic to go find the piece of glass and then bring it back and maybe buy some tools and get it in. So we just worked on this on the board, and it looked like it would take a full day of one of their, either one would be required to spend a full day to get this pane of glass repaired. And they could actually, in looking at how much time it takes to do something like that, laugh a little about what they were expecting of the other and how little reality testing was going on in their relationship. And I mentioned this anecdote to analogize to how little reality testing tends to go on for all human beings, but for young music students perhaps especially, in thinking about their relationships. Because our culture rewards individual accomplishment, and because each music student is thinking about individual accomplishment, it's very hard to get relating even on the table. In their mindset, institutionally is one thing, but even in the individual musician's mindset, to get the idea of the necessity, the desire for relating into their head is very difficult. What kinds of relationships are we talking about? Well, self-relationship, as Louise was talking about it, as Susan was talking about it. Self-relationship is probably the primary relationship that we'll be talking about all morning. But then there are relationships with peers, relationships with intimate others, relationships with teachers, special relationships with experts and authority figures, relationships with critics, and of course everyone is a critic, but then there's also the class of actual professional critics. Interesting relationships with audience members, even how to deal with the moment after a performance when you're told that you did well, just what that experience is like, and how to even say thank you, as opposed to fumbling around with some way of being after a performance. Relationship with your instrument, and then relationships with family members, including, of course, those calls back to home for the additional money and the thoughts about changing professions and all of those kinds of relationship issues. So there's a wide variety of relationship issues, virtually in some ways an infinite number of, but at least those are some of the categories of relationship issues that we would want music students to be savvier about. So are there some things that cut across all of those categories that we really want music students to know? And I think there are 5. I wanted to restrict it. As good postmodern people, we know that we could do it as 5 or 27 or 150, but I want to hold it to 5 so that maybe we can keep it in our minds. The first is that we want an awareness of relating as a domain of interest. We want to get relating on the table to music students. And I think every stakeholder has a stake in that and can do it differently. At the administrative level, it might be done one way. As a music teacher, it might be done another way. As a counseling center person, it might be done another way. But if everyone were wanting to, if everyone in this room and everyone at a music school were interested in promulgating the idea that relationship mattered, that relating was a useful domain, that would be possibly the most important first thing. The second thing we would want to get across to music students is that they want to make an investment in relating. In addition to the investment they make in their musicianship and the investment they make in their personal journey and personal path and ambitiousness and what have you, that they want to make an investment in relating. And this can be framed in many different ways, that of course they will need to get along in ensemble work, or of course they'll want to do networking so that they get the best gigs. And so there are many ways to speak about why they would want to make this investment. But however we speak about it, still the main idea is that they get the idea that they ought to, want to, make an investment in relating. As an aside, Georgia O'Keeffe was once asked about friendship, and she said, friendship is something that takes a long time to do. It takes a long time to cultivate a friend. And we're all rushing in life, and because music students are where they are developmentally and in terms of their ambitiousness, having the time to do some of the things that all of us will be talking about, but especially relating, doesn't feel available to them. So this is, as an aside, somehow inviting students to slow down or even entirely stop and think about things, even as they necessarily must rush through their program and rush through their day, is again something that each of us, I think, could invite our students to do, even as we ourselves feel like we can't get our eternal to-do list done. So we ourselves probably need to practice that same slowing down and stopping if we are interested in relationships in our own life. So to repeat, relating as a domain and investment in relating are the first two ideas. The third is we want them to be able to identify relationship red flags. That is, we want to provide them with a few helpful ideas about what constitutes poor or ineffective or dangerous relating. And we could make a whole list here. I just want to mention a few. And were there to be a real list generated at some point and provided to music schools, it would be a much longer and more detailed list than this. I just want to give the headlines. One would be that you would want them to notice if they're not feeling like they're fitting in, or if they're feeling isolated, because isolation is a relationship issue as well as a personal psychological issue. One of the cures for feeling isolated or feeling like you're not fitting in is fitting in better and being less isolated and relating. So if in a counseling setting or just in an everyday conversation, a student is saying, I feel really isolated here and like I don't fit in, the response in whatever language it is that you are accustomed to using or want to use is, try relating. Take somebody out for a cup of coffee. Learn what the rock and rollers are doing, even if you're a classical musician or vice versa. Relate. And that turns out to be an antidote to feelings of isolation. Second would be if they experience their relationships as very dramatic and if they experience lots of relationship crises. If a student is telling you that there's something very unusually dramatic about every relationship he or she enters into, that for you is a red flag. And even more importantly, we want somehow students to know that these are red flags, that relationships ought to be a little quieter than the most dramatic relationships look. That would not be the way we would expect people to have good relationships, as if there were fireworks every single moment of the day. The third thing we want them to know about, it was called something different previously. I'm going to call it splitting, but it's the idea of first idealizing someone else and then devaluing that person. Black and white thinking is sometimes also called. If a student notices that she's absolutely in love with her music teacher one day, and then the music teacher criticizes her just a little, and then that's the worst music teacher she's ever encountered the next day, we call that splitting, and that's something for students to just be aware of as a relationship issue. What's one of the, well, there are many antidotes having to do with individual psychological work, but in addition to individual psychological work, one important thing to promulgate as an idea is to not put people on pedestals to begin with, to kind of figure out for yourself how to normalize relationships. And even if you are the authority figure or the best player in the world, I still want to meet you as if you were an equal, psychologically speaking, rather than putting you up here. Because if I put you up here, my natural internal tendency is to get you down there eventually, is to knock you off that pedestal. So in a relationship sense, we want our students to feel more like our equals rather than our inferiors, so that they don't have to then make us their inferiors or superior, however that sentence ends. The fourth the fourth red flag we would want them to be aware of has to do with whether they experience their relationships as both brief and lacking in intimacy. And it's natural that in a school setting, in this developmental age, they're going to go through lots of relationships. They're going to have lots of brief relationships. So there's nothing, that's not a telling sign of anything that a student has many brief relationships. But if he or she is experiencing all of his or her intimate relationships as brief, if you're just running through partners and not feeling like the other person is really there in the relationship or that you're not really there in the relationship, that's a profound red flag that you're having relationship difficulties and intimacy difficulties. And the last of these 5, as I say, this could be an enormous list, but the last red flag would be if you feel like you're entering into dependent relationships, or if you are reaching out for relationships because you feel really needy as opposed to because you want to be with the other person. And again, all of these are teachable as ideas to our students. Like if there were just one good guidebook or handout or what have you that articulated these ideas in everyday language and that students could have, they would learn lots from just having this available. They would not necessarily need school-wide workshops or what have you. So let me just backtrack. These were 3 ideas: relating as a domain, investment in relating, and identifying red flags. There are 2 more. 4, we want them to know where to turn when they have relationship issues. And this, of course, I'm sure we'll be talking about over the days, and that is what are the resources on campus or the resources off campus available to them so they know where to turn for relationship issues. Of course, one sort of obvious response to that question, where do they turn, is to a relationship counselor. But since usually there are not relationship counselors even in a counseling center, we are hoping that the interns and licensed professionals at counseling centers also have good ways of working on relationship issues, including working with groups and ensembles and orchestras and what have you. And then 5th, we want, and this connects to what Louise was presenting, we want them to learn some self-care or self-coaching strategies. We want them to have things available in their own mental repertoire to use. And I think that there are a handful of self-care or self-coaching strategies, and we'll be talking about them all morning in one form or another, that we want our students to have. One is we want them to have at least one anxiety management tool. They don't necessarily need a whole repertoire of things to do to reduce anxiety, but they do need one thing that they actually own, that they actually can do. Because part of the difficulties in relating is the way in which anxiety rises up in us before certain kinds of relational interactions, like an audition or meeting a new teacher or even chatting with a peer sometimes. So since relationships are harmed by the anxiety that we experience that wells up in us that prevents us from being, let's say, all there or normal in relationships, we want our students to have one anxiety management tool at least. And to piggyback on and to repeat what Louise is on this side, good, that what Louise said, she named breathing first, and I would name breathing first too, and I would go as far as saying, if you would promote the idea that even one cleansing breath, one deep breath, 5 seconds or 6 seconds on the inhale and 5 seconds or 6 seconds on the exhale, will do you a world of good to reduce anxiety, you will already be doing your students a world of good. Because it really is hard for anyone to try to possess 73 anxiety management tools. We're not equipped to do that. So to get one at least that works is important. And then again, to piggyback on what Louise said, I think we want to promote at least one cognitive tool. We want students to be better aware of what they're thinking, of their own self-talk, their own language, and have something to do about it. To not just be able to hear what they're saying, but then to know what they're saying means and then what to do about it. Cognitive therapists sometimes teach a really simple 3-step process, and I want to mention it because I think it's useful to know and actually easy to adapt in many settings. The first step is to actually identify your own self-talk, to hear yourself and your own tricks. And I really do mean tricks because we disguise our issues from ourselves. So if we are feeling anxious, we may say, I'm feeling tired, or I'm feeling something else. So if we hear ourselves saying, I'm feeling tired, at some point we want to be able to notice or identify that that isn't actually about fatigue, but about an upcoming performance, let's say. So it's getting awareness of our own self-talk and trickery. And then step 2 of this little 3-step process is disputing that piece of talk. And I would dispute it loudly, as I sometimes do, but because I'm amplified, I might blow our ears out. You really want to dispute it with some energy and say, no, I'm not really tired. This is about something else. I'm savvy enough, smart enough, I'm good enough at self-care to know that this is not about being tired. This is about something else, and I refuse to accept my own self-statement. And then step 3 is to have what's called a thought substitute, to have something to say that replaces that first thought. So instead of now saying, I'm too tired to practice, your new thought, and colloquially or characteristically, we now call this thought substitute an affirmation often. It's some positive, simple, declarative thing we say to ourselves that help us go along in life. So in response to the I am feeling too tired, our thought substitute might be, I'm perfectly fine. Something really simple that we can replicate and use over and over again to take care of the many tricky things we say to ourselves to defeat us. How am I doing? I have to wrap up. So there's about 73 other things here. Should I go right to the conclusion? Yes. I'm going to say one other thing. 2 other things.
3.
No, only 2. So we also want them to have at least one sense. We want them to have a sense of how communication skills work, because relating and communicating are twin pieces here, which I think means having some communication workshops available on campus. If you wanted to think of one of the things that connect to relationship issues, then having communication workshops would be one of them. And then very last thing, because criticism is so important in music students' lives, again, as Louise said, and so important in relational issues, we do want them to have some way to deal with criticism. And again, I think sometimes only one strategy is all that's needed. And I think a good one, I just want to put this out there, is I have clients write Dear Critic letters, which they then don't post. But they're ways of ventilating feelings around criticism. So that's an odd place to end a relationship piece, but we'll keep talking. Thank you.
As you can tell, our group could just really go on for 3 days just by ourselves. We may continue to do this after we've seen the last of you. Anyway, thank you, Eric. And next I'd like to present my friend and colleague, Dr. John Hipple, who's a counselor at the University of North Texas Testing and Counseling Service. And I've had the privilege of getting to really have fun things with Dr. Hipple by doing panels at the South by Southwest Music Conference in Austin, Texas, which John graciously invited me to start doing with him almost 10 years ago when we were young. And that's really fun. We do a band communication panel there sometimes and then get to go hear a whole bunch of bands. Anyway, John's going to talk to you today about anxiety and stress. And
Here I am.
there you are.
All this changing of costume. I'm going to start off with pretending that I'm going to have an audition and you're not going to be able to see me. Now think about all this time that some of your kids have to stand behind this flat screen and play to win a job. Oh my gosh, how stressful is that? I'm also a person that has to have control. So I hate sitting behind this. You guys will just have to look at my back. As a counselor who gets paid to talk with kids in pain, I'm happy to tell you that stress and anxiety is alive and well. It's the kids' student fees that pay my job, pay my salary. So I love it that there's this stress. My wife loves it. My kid, who goes to Trinity University down the road, which costs $25,000 a year, loves it. So I also didn't get to practice this morning. For those of you that were stuck here, I'm up the road in dynamic Denton, and we had an inch of rain at our house starting at 4 o'clock this morning. So I missed my last preparation. I didn't get to walk Ted the dog in the park for an hour and practice, so I have a little preparation anxiety here. So what you're seeing is a vast mix of how people deal with stress and anxiety. When you think about stress and anxiety, my belief is that you've got to recognize that there's 1,000,000 different definitions. And what we have to do, I think, as teachers and counselors is figure out how the kid in front of us is showing us his or her pain. And then we have to deal with that presentation. I think that one of the things that you're going to get a flavor of as we continue to talk is that there's many different definitions for all this sort of stuff. And there's overlap. How in the heavens, I swear a lot, and I'm going to try not to swear. I'm terribly not politically correct. The older I get, the worse it gets. But there's a lot of overlap. And how do I tell if this kid is stressed? How do I tell if this kid is depressed? How do I tell if this kid is nuts? How do I tell? And your job, I think, as educators, is to know your kid. I turned 65 a couple days ago. Oh my goodness, now we have this huge population that I can now call kids. If you know your kid, how he or she typically is, that's step one to dealing with stress and anxiety, because then you'll be able to know when they're different. And that's what you have to do as an educator, is when your kid looks, sounds, acts a bit different, that's the cue to approach. That's it. You got to approach them. And you as educators, I think, have to be willing to approach your kid, no matter how you teach them, from an emotional perspective. I got extremely worried yesterday when we were talking about this litigiousness and legalistic and, oh my God, are we therapists and can we dare talk about emotionality? Well, my gosh, if we can't talk about emotionality as a teacher, we're in a pretty sad shape. So my encouragement to you is know your kid. When they're different, approach them and be willing to talk to them on make some sort of emotional connection that's outside of their world of music, that who they are as a kid sitting with you, no matter what they're teaching, what your teaching role is. I think that you have to have some sense of what kids are experiencing, especially our younger ones, cause stress and anxiety. A couple of years ago, I had this 17-year-old girl show up in the counseling center in the spring. 17-year-old in the spring shows, pretty bright girl, string player, performance anxiety, tears, and we started listing her problems. She had a handful of problems. Performance anxiety and not doing good academically and financial problems, and mom and dad were divorced and dad wanted to be a lawyer and mother said it's okay to be a musician and her boyfriend was causing her problems. All those problems, stress, anxiety, all over the place. She was a wreck. Do you know what she wanted to work on? Boyfriend. Makes sense for a 17-year-old. And as we worked on how to handle boyfriend, how to deal with him, how to be an equal, the other stuff fell into place. Okay, so you got to be aware of the normal developmental issues that our kids experience. Then you got to be aware of the normal developmental issues that our college students have. Leaving home, oh my gosh. Living in a dormitory room with somebody else. Financial, all that stuff that comes with just being a college student. And as you're aware of that, and as you're helping kids handle that issue, they're going to be less stressed and less anxious, and less depressed, and less nuts, and all that kind of stuff. Then, of course, you've got to be well aware of what special problems musicians have. Oh my gosh. I was this first viola in Crum High School. Now, Crum High School is this little tiny baby town of 1,000, I don't know. First chair, and I'm now at UNT, and there's 1,000 other first chair people. Oh my God. And that's a mixed bag. That's expectations. We have, at UNT, we have freshman guitar players who want to be in our 1 o'clock lab band, and they're lucky if they can be in our midnight lab band. Expectations, competition, standards. How do we help kids and parents have reasonable expectations? So if we're paying attention on these 3 levels to our kids, normal developmental, college experience, music experience, and if we're helping them understand and giving them skills to deal with that, stress and anxiety is going to be ebbing down. And again, I'm going to say, gosh, you guys have so much to offer. Why send them to me? How's my time? Halfway done?
Yeah, no, you're doing okay.
Oh, I'm doing fine. Good. I forgot to look at my watch as I kept up there because it's old and it's
I
a
think we are
Timex.
going to have to book you on the Letterman show after this, though.
Okay. What can I say? Okay. I gotta look at. I'm halfway done. I'll skip professional musicians. Oh. Oh. I'll skip professional musicians. I'm going to the International Bluegrass Music Conference on Sunday. I'm on the wellness committee for them, and we'll be in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm on the wellness committee for the IBMA, and so we'll get to do some of this again in Louisville with no, I was going to say real musicians, but that would be terrible.
Idealization and devaluation.
Gets their attention. Okay. One of the next thing you really have to be aware of in all this kind of stuff is what are some of the basic symptom patterns that kids present when they are stressed and anxious. And of course, there is the emotional component. Kids are going to be sad or mad or scared. There's the cognitive component. When kids are stressed, their cognitions are going to blow out. They're not going to be able to memorize. They're not going to be able to focus. They're not going to be able to explain themselves to you. They're not going to be able to take what you have to say into them. There's a physical component to stress and anxiety, again, which is individually displayed. But they're going to have eating problems and sleeping problems and fatigue problems. And then there's a social component. Most often, I think, when people are stressed and anxious, they're going to be into social withdrawal. If they've got cognitive, emotional, and physical symptoms, they can hardly deal with themselves, let alone anybody else. So there's going to be this isolation, which has been talked about. And so you've got to be observant. I started off with knowing your kid from all of these factors that affect them and helping them gain skills. And then knowing the presenting symptoms, and then again, where I started from, being willing to engage. What I worry about in big schools like UNT is, are we preparing our TFs and TAs to be this observant? I don't know about y'all, and this might be terrible because there are lots of UNT people here, but I'm afraid that our TFs and TAs get the most high at-risk students, who are probably more susceptible to all this breakdown. And what I would want you to think about is that when you look at the teaching responsibilities of your TAs and TFs, do they know about this kind of stuff, and do they have permission from y'all to engage in an appropriate fashion? So think about that. Okay, now, what the heck other kinds of things can you do? I've talked about expectations, clarifying expectations from the get-go. When kids come in and audition on your campus this spring, are you going to be talking to your kid and their parents and their teachers about what kind of stuff they're going to be getting when they come on your campus? Are they prepared expectation-wise? From a teaching perspective, what I really like to push is, I have to put this down. I took piano lessons at age, I don't know, repressing it, 10 or 12, in Regina McLaughlin's house next door to us in Marcus, Iowa. And Regina, we'd be playing along, and Regina would say, "John, that's wrong!" And her claws would come crashing down. I think I still have scars. The point is that when you think about, whoops, I'm not going to leave my notes. When you think about your teaching, I would hope that you could emphasize strengths. When you look at stress and anxiety, that is because there is weakness going on. There is lack of self-confidence. There is lack of competence as well as confidence. I like to say, in terms of lessons in learning music, each lesson would be something like this. Barbara, these are the kinds of things that I'd like you to work on for next lesson. And this is how I'd like you to work on it. You notice I'm not using mistake. I'm not using wrong. These are the things I'd like you to work on. This is how I'd like you to try and incorporate the change. And this is what you did good. From a psychological perspective, from anxiety and stress reduction, if we can focus on what's good in what we've done, then that bigness increases. And yet kids sitting in my office are inundated with wrong, bad, not good enough. And they fold. So that would be the major thing I would push from a teacher's perspective. Change the vocabulary, support the strength, and then stress and anxiety is going to be less and less and less and less. And for the third and fourth time and last, don't forget to use yourself. Hopefully your department, well, you guys are all, the bosses will say, okay, talk to this kid about what she's feeling, and I'll back you up if something crazy happens. Okay. Next thing would be, take a look at who the resources are that you can refer a really upset kid to. Who's in your counseling center? Who, in your college community, in your greater community, who can I refer my kids to? Do I know that person? Does that person know about musicians? Do they have a sense of what it's like to really be a creative person in this really great business? You have just as much responsibility to find good caregivers as caregivers have responsibilities to reach out to you. Okay, I could go on and on and on, but I won't. So that's stress and anxiety. And we can take care of it. We really can. And if you guys do more, I'll do less, and I'll get to sit in my office and read books. Thank you.